Chapter 1. The Cold Alpha in the Rain. The city at night always looked softer through the veil of rain. Streetlights blurred into halos, traffic hissed against wet asphalt, and umbrellas bobbed like dark mushrooms on the sidewalks. Atlas Monroe tightened his grip on the bouquet of peonies in his hand and darted across the crosswalk, muttering under his breath as icy droplets crept down the back of his neck. He'd promised the anniversary flowers before closing, and he kept his promises, even if it meant running errands in a storm. As he reached the opposite curb, movement caught his eye. A man stood rigid in the median, tall and immovable as stone despite the downpour. He wasn't dressed for the weather. No coat, only a thin, soaked shirt plastered against broad shoulders. Rain streamed down the planes of his face and caught in the hollow of his throat. His knuckles were raw, split in several places as though he'd driven them into something harder than flesh. Atlas slowed, heart-tripping. The man's eyes, pale, storm cloud gray, stared blankly ahead. He looked like the rain was the only thing holding him upright. A pair of students hurried past, whispering just loud enough for Atlas to catch. "That's him, isn't it? Vale's Alpha." The cold one. Even his own pack threw him out. Atlas's stomach twisted. He'd heard the stories, the murmurs about the Vale heir who never smiled, never softened, who was more stone than man. Some claimed he'd been violent, others that he simply lacked the warmth an Alpha was supposed to radiate. Either way, the verdict had been the same: exile. Common sense told Atlas to keep walking, to tuck his umbrella close, deliver the peonies, and pretend he hadn't seen the way rain dripped from that man's lashes like tears he'd never admit to. But common sense had never been his strongest suit. Atlas's steps slowed to a stop. He adjusted his umbrella, swallowed the nervous flutter in his throat, and walked back out into the storm. "Hey," he called, raising the umbrella over both of them. The man blinked once, as if dragging himself back from miles away. His scent, cedar, smoke, winter rain, cut cleanly through the damp air, grounding and startling all at once. Atlas's chest tightened at the rawness of it. "You look like you lost a fight with the weather," Atlas said lightly, trying for humor. The Alpha's voice came rough, cracked at the edges. "I lost more than that." The words landed heavy between them, a confession and a wound. Atlas bit the inside of his cheek, debating, then heard himself speak before fear could stop him. "My place is a block over. You can warm up there. Tea, a couch, just for the night." For a long beat, the man only stared at him, gray eyes unreadable, rain dripping steadily from his jaw. Pride and something more fragile warred across his face. Then, finally, he gave the smallest nod. Dignity frayed, not gone. Atlas adjusted the umbrella to shield more of him, pretending he didn't notice how much broader the Alpha was at his side. The foyer smelled faintly of lemon polish and old carpet. Mrs. Dalloway, their landlady, peeked out from her apartment door the second Atlas wrestled the umbrella shut. She was a small, bird-like woman with eyes sharp enough to catch everything. "Well now," she said, gaze flicking from Atlas to the towering Alpha dripping on her floor. In 2 steps, she fetched a stack of towels, pressing them firmly into the man's hands. "Some people need warm roofs and warmer company." She winked at Atlas as she shut her door, leaving them with towels and silence. Atlas rubbed the back of his neck, cheeks hot. She's like that with everyone," he said. The Alpha simply held the towels, expression unreadable, as if unsure whether he deserved them. Atlas's apartment was small but lived in, cozy in a way that had nothing to do with size. Books stacked precariously near the couch. Plants crowded the windowsill, and a kettle steamed faintly on the stove. Parker, he hadn't given his name yet, but Atlas had heard it in whispers, stood like a statue just inside the door, dripping steadily onto the rug. "You're going to mildew if you keep standing there," Atlas said, trying for casual. He rummaged through drawers, producing his largest hoodie and a pair of sweatpants that would definitely be too short. "Shower's through there. Hot water's temperamental, so twist the knob gently." For a long moment, Parker didn't move. Then he accepted the bundle with a curt nod and disappeared down the hall. When he returned, damp hair falling into his eyes, Atlas nearly dropped the tea mugs he was setting out. The hoodie clung across Parker's shoulders, stretching fabric taut, the sleeves ending high on his forearms. It was ridiculous and distracting, and Atlas's brain promptly short-circuited. "Looks better on you than it ever did on me," he blurted, then winced. Something flickered at the corner of Parker's mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough. They sat, steaming tea between them. Atlas set boundaries because that was the smart thing to do. So ground rules: don't break any doors, no weird alpha dominance rituals, no scent marking the couch. Deal? Parker's gaze was steady, voice flat. I have no pack to dominate. The words landed like a bruise. Atlas's chest tightened. He covered the ache with a quip. Then we'll get along fine. Later, Atlas curled into his bed, exhaustion tugging at his eyes. Parker refused the couch, choosing instead the armchair by the window, posture rigid, gaze fixed on the city beyond. Rain streaked the glass in silver lines. Atlas watched through heavy lashes as Parker sat unmoving, back straight, shoulders squared as if the world might come for them at any second. Sleep dragged him under. When he stirred hours later, the storm had quieted. Parker was still in the chair, but this time his gaze wasn't on the window. It was on Atlas. Not hungry, not possessive. Just raw. Vigilant, as though Atlas's shallow breathing mattered more than his own. Sleep, Atlas whispered, voice husky with drowsiness. He pulled the blanket from his bed and draped it gently over Parker's shoulders. For a moment, those glacier eyes softened. Parker let his head rest back against the chair. And for the first time that day, maybe longer, he slept. 9 minutes, Atlas counted, before his breaths hitched back awake. On the floor, Parker's cracked phone buzzed once. The screen lit with a text. You made your choice. Don't come back. His jaw tightened. He deleted it without reading further, and in the quiet of Atlas's apartment, the storm finally broke. Chapter 2. Shelter and Scent. Morning slipped quietly into Atlas's apartment, the rain from the night before leaving the world outside soft and muted. Pale light pooled against the curtains, catching the edges of stacked books and potted plants, making the tiny kitchen feel almost like a painting. Atlas hummed under his breath as he cracked eggs into a pan, the sizzle filling the air. Tea steeped in 2 mugs on the counter, steam curling upward like ghosts. Behind him, he could feel the presence of the Alpha, silent, looming, awkward as hell. Parker stood near the doorway as though he needed permission to enter. His damp hair from the late-night shower was tousled, and Atlas noticed how the hoodie clung to him in ways it was never designed to. Still, Parker looked out of place, like a wolf trapped indoors. You can sit, you know, Atlas said, flipping the eggs. Chairs exist for a reason. There was a beat, and then the scrape of wood as Parker obeyed. He sat too stiffly, shoulders squared, hands braced on his knees, like he was waiting for instructions. Atlas slid a plate in front of him first. Parker's gaze flicked down to it, and for the briefest second his face shifted. The stone gray of his eyes softened, like a crack letting in light. I'm not used to being inside, Parker said, voice flat but carrying a strange honesty that pulled at Atlas's chest. Atlas sank into the opposite chair with his own plate, tilting his head. Well, consider this practice. 4 walls, a roof, breakfast. It's not scary. Parker's gaze lingered on the plate again before he picked up a fork with careful precision, as though the simple act of eating at a table was foreign. Atlas pretended not to notice how each bite was measured, deliberate, as if Parker was afraid of taking too much. After dishes, Parker lingered in the living room, uncertain. Atlas dried his hands on a towel, studying the man who looked far too large for the small apartment. You've got nowhere else to go, do you? Atlas asked softly. Parker's eyes shifted to him, unflinching. No, Atlas swallowed. His first instinct was to guard himself. Bringing a stranger, an alpha no less, into his home wasn't exactly safe. But when he looked at Parker, he didn't see danger. He saw someone holding himself together with brittle edges, afraid the whole structure might collapse. You can stay. Just for now, Atlas said, even though his hands were already moving on their own, setting out a second mug on the shelf as if it belonged there. His body betrayed what his words tried to hedge. Parker's gaze flicked to the mug, then back to Atlas. Something unspoken passed between them, too fragile to name. The next hours fell into a strange rhythm. Atlas filled out a spare key request form for the landlady, mumbling that it was just in case. Parker crouched to tighten the screws on the squeaky cabinet under the sink, hands steady and precise. Atlas laughed when the kettle whistled and explained that its shrill sound was his cue for home. Parker only nodded once, but the next time the whistle sang, Atlas caught the way Parker's shoulders eased. At the flower shop, the day smelled of roses and fresh soil. Atlas arranged bouquets behind the counter while Elijah leaned against the register, all sharp elbows and mischievous grin. "So," Elijah drawled, "rumor has it you've got a house guest. Tall, broad, terrifying. Care to explain?" Atlas shot him a look. "Rumor mill needs a hobby." "That's not a no," Elijah teased, sing-song. "Tell me, does he brood dramatically in corners or just hover behind you like a bodyguard?" Atlas snorted, refusing to give him the satisfaction. Still, warmth curled low in his belly when he thought of Parker waiting quietly in the apartment. The door chimed. Mrs. Dalloway shuffled in, carrying her oversized purse. "Lilies, please," she said, "for new beginnings." She cast Atlas a knowing glance, lips twitching at the corners. "Best to keep some around." Atlas busied himself with wrapping the stems, ignoring Elijah's barely suppressed laughter. The city could whisper all it wanted. In the shop, surrounded by blooms and greenery, Atlas found peace. That night, the apartment was hushed. Parker had refused the couch again, choosing instead the floor beside Atlas's bed. When Atlas questioned him, Parker only muttered, "Closer to the door." It sounded like a promise to intercept whatever came through. Atlas drifted to sleep with the steady awareness of the Alpha's presence just feet away. Sometime past midnight, he woke to warmth. It pressed heavy and intoxicating, a tide of cedar and rain spilling through the room. His skin flushed, heart pounding. He turned his head. Parker was asleep on the floor, his breath slow, his jaw slack in rare peace. But his pheromones had slipped loose, saturating the air until Atlas's chest ached with it. Atlas's hand twitched toward him before he caught himself. He whispered Parker's name, low and careful. The Alpha jerked awake instantly, body coiling. His sense snapped back like a tide retreating, leaving only faint traces. He sat up, chest heaving, guilt carved deep into his expression. "I will not overrun your space," Parker said, voice hoarse, almost pained. Atlas sat up too, meeting his eyes. "You didn't. Your body asked for safety. That's not wrong." Parker looked at him as though the words were a language he barely recognized. Atlas pushed off the blanket, opened a window to let the night air cool the room. Then he padded to the kitchen, boiled water, and set a mug of tea by Parker's hand. "Here. Grounding helps. Drink." Parker obeyed, fingers curling tight around the mug, as though the warmth tethered him back. Later, they sat together on the rug, silence wrapping them close. Their hands ended up inches apart, not quite touching but near enough that the space hummed. Atlas studied Parker's profile, the hard line of his jaw, the scar cutting across it, the lashes darker for lack of sleep. And yet, here in this fragile moment, he looked more human than the rumors ever allowed. "You're not broken," Atlas murmured. Parker's head turned slightly, eyes searching his. "Why are you kind to me?" Atlas smiled, small and crooked. He reached for the blanket draped over the back of the couch and settled it across both their shoulders, creating a tiny tent of warmth. Because someone should be. They sat like that until Atlas's eyelids drooped, the blanket cocooning them against the night. Safe, not sexual, yet charged with something unspoken. When Atlas rose to head to bed, he tossed the new key into the bowl by the door. It landed with a soft clink. Parker's eyes followed it. For a moment, he looked at the key not as metal, but as something fragile and rare. He looked at it the way another man might look at a ring. Chapter 3. The clingy side of cold life had a way of adjusting itself around Parker's presence, as though the city itself was learning to accommodate a figure too broad and steady for its narrow sidewalks. Atlas noticed it in small things at first. The grocery bag that normally threatened to split on the walk home. Parker carried it one-handed, hardly straining, as if the weight didn't exist. The bathroom lock that had jammed for weeks and made Atlas curse under his breath. Fixed, silently, while Atlas was at class, the only evidence Parker's careful tightening of screws and a door that now clicked shut smoothly. The strangest shift, though, was the campus routine. Parker walked with him to the literature building every morning. He didn't follow inside, didn't hover in the hallways. Instead, he waited on the steps, head tipped back toward the wide sky, as if memorizing its shade of blue that day. When Atlas returned, Parker rose without needing words, falling into step beside him like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're like a very large, very scary shadow," Atlas teased one afternoon, balancing a stack of books against his hip. Parker glanced down at him, expression unreadable. Good. No one hurts what's mine. The word landed heavy, louder than the shuffle of feet on the quad, louder than the squeak of wet sneakers. Mine. Parker startled at his own slip, shoulders tightening. His gaze dropped away and his next words came softer, almost brittle. If you want me here. Atlas's throat went dry. The way Parker said it, like his presence depended on Atlas's permission, like being wanted was a luxury he didn't expect, made Atlas's chest ache. He forced a smile, bumping Parker's arm lightly with his elbow. Yeah, I do. The following day, a group of alphas jostled past them near the library steps, their laughter too loud, their shoulders too wide. Atlas's stomach dipped, instincts urging him to step aside. Before he could, Parker's entire body stilled, attention snapping through his frame. He didn't snarl or puff his chest the way some alphas might. He simply shifted, placing himself between Atlas and the crowd, his broad back a wall of quiet strength. Atlas blinked, half startled. He felt shielded. Then Parker looked down at him, eyes pale and steady. May I touch your shoulder? The question stopped Atlas in his tracks. Consent. Always. Not a command. Not a presumption. Permission. Atlas nodded once. Parker's hand settled lightly over his shoulder. Not heavy, not restrictive, just there. A warm weight against the fabric of his hoodie. Atlas realized absurdly that his pulse had quickened at the simple contact. Mrs. Dalloway caught Parker in the stairwell that evening, the old bulb above them newly lit. Thank you for fixing that, she said, voice gentle but sure. I've asked maintenance for months. It's all right, to be needed. Parker froze mid-step, words caught behind his teeth. The idea seemed to strike him like a foreign concept. Needed. Useful in ways that weren't destructive. His throat bobbed, but he couldn't find a reply. Mrs. Dalloway only smiled, patting his arm before shuffling back to her apartment. Parker stood there a long time, the echo of her words ringing in his chest. That night, the shadows returned. Atlas woke to the sound of Parker's breathing, harsh and uneven. The alpha's body twisted on the floor, muscles straining, jaw locked in silent anguish. His hand shot out, fisting blindly in the edge of Atlas's blanket as though clinging to the last tether he had. Atlas slid from his bed without hesitation, crouching beside him. Hey, Parker, it's all right. Parker's eyes snapped open, wild with remnants of a nightmare, voices that only he could hear. Atlas grabbed his wrist gently, guiding his hand to his hoodie. Here, anchor, just hold on. Parker obeyed, fingers curling into the soft fabric at Atlas's chest. His whole frame trembled, breaths jagged. Breathe with me, Atlas urged, voice calm but firm. He counted softly, matching his inhale and exhale with Parker's. He could feel the alpha fighting for control, struggling to cage back whatever storm roared inside him. Slowly, the trembling eased. His chest rose and fell in time with Atlas's. The kettle whistled faintly from the kitchen, a sound Parker had already learned to associate with safety. Atlas tightened his grip, grounding him in the present. In the stillness that followed, Atlas leaned forward and pressed his lips to Parker's temple. It was a soft kiss, nothing more, but intentional, a choice. Parker's breath hitched, stalling in his chest before releasing in a shudder. His hand, still clinging to Atlas's hoodie, trembled once more before stilling. His voice was raw when it came. I won't hurt you. It sounded less like reassurance and more like a vow to himself. Atlas closed his eyes briefly, letting his forehead rest against Parker's. I know. The next evening, they spread textbooks across the rug, creating what Atlas jokingly called their study fort. Highlighters rolled across the floor, notes stacked in messy towers. Their knees touched as they worked, casual at first, then too deliberate to ignore. Each time their fingers brushed while passing pens or paper, Atlas felt a small jolt. He tried to focus on the text, but he couldn't help noticing the little things. The way Parker turned pages with surprising gentleness, calloused fingers careful not to crease the paper. The way his gaze lingered on Atlas when he thought Atlas wasn't looking, soft and searching. And Parker noticed things too. He noticed the way Atlas bit the inside of his cheek when concentrating, how his lips pursed when he was stuck on a line of poetry. Without a word, Parker slid a glass of water closer, nudging it into Atlas's hand like it was the most natural gesture in the world. Atlas looked up, startled, and found Parker watching him with quiet intensity. Neither spoke, But the silence was heavy with something new, something fragile and powerful all at once. Outside, the city moved on, unaware. But across the street, a figure lingered in the shadows, eyes fixed on the apartment window. Marcel, the former beta friend. His expression was unreadable as he watched the faint glow of lamplight where Atlas and Parker sat shoulder to shoulder, the faintest thread of connection beginning to weave between them. Chapter 4. Heat of Belonging. Elijah arrived like he always did, on a gust of city air and the sugary clink of ice against plastic. The bell above the flower shop door chimed, and he sashayed in, sunshades perched on his head as if the cloudy day existed only to flatter him. "For my favorite florist and his suspiciously taller shadow," he announced, setting a sweating cup on the counter with a flourish. "Iced vanilla for you, Atlas. And does your shadow take his coffee black, or just brewed it straight from the void?" Atlas laughed, cheeks warming. "You're insufferable." "Correct, and yet beloved." Elijah leaned across the counter as if sharing state secrets. "Also, rumor update, half of campus thinks you tamed a refrigerator. The other half wants the serial number." Atlas coughed, nearly snorting iced coffee out his nose. "Please stop referring to him as an appliance." "Fine," Elijah relented, eyes dancing. "Tell me the model name later." His gaze hopped past Atlas's shoulder. The shop door was propped open to let the cool breeze in, and Parker stood just outside, shoulders a right angle of tension, eyes skimming the street. He was a wall in a hoodie, an iceberg with a heartbeat. "He's handsome," Elijah added, softer, "and he looks at you like you're a language he's trying to learn." Atlas's heart tapped an unsteady rhythm. "He's good. He's trying." Elijah's smile crooked. "You deserve someone who adores you publicly. No leaving you to do all the choosing." He said it lightly, but the truth of it slipped between them like the blade edge of a petal. Parker's gaze flicked their way when Elijah laughed, and Atlas felt the shift before he scented it. A deepening of cedar and rain, a thread of protective warmth winding into the air like incense. Not possessive, defensive. Atlas had learned the difference. Elijah noticed too. His grin curved into something approving. He reached across the counter and kissed Atlas's cheek, noisy on purpose. "I'm working a delivery 2 blocks over," he said loudly enough that Parker could hear. "I'll be back to help close." "Don't break his heart, big guy," he added, looking straight past Atlas to Parker, mischief and sincerity braided tight. Parker blinked as if Elijah had handed him a job description he didn't know he'd already accepted. His chin dipped once, a solemn nod that wasn't theatrical. Atlas felt it like the click of a lock he hadn't realized was engaged. Elijah swanned out, dragging the breeze with him. The little bell settled back into silence. Parker exhaled slowly, shoulders lowering half an inch. "Sorry about him," Atlas murmured. "He's efficient," Parker said after a beat, as if he were testing possible adjectives. His eyes hovered on the pink press of Elijah's kiss, fading on Atlas's cheek. Cedar swelled again, softer. "You shouldn't have to ask for what you deserve." "I'm working on that, actually," Atlas said, and he smiled. Back at the apartment, the storm that had grumbled all day finally chased itself to the windows. Rain braided down the glass, catching the lamplight and breaking it into beads. Parker closed the door behind them carefully, as if anything too loud might spook Atlas or the fragile quiet they were keeping. He left his boots by the mat, lined perfectly beside Atlas's smaller pair, then went still, hands flexing at his sides. The scent of wet wool and cedar rose like heat off pavement. Atlas shrugged out of his jacket and felt the weight of Parker's attention follow the motion. He placed the jacket on the chair. Parker's gaze tracked the curve of his wrist as if it were a map he was trying not to memorize. "Do you want tea?" Atlas asked, because tea had become the thing that lived between them when words were too sharp to chew. Parker moved before Atlas could cross the kitchen. Not fast, just decisive. He stepped into Atlas's space, close enough that Atlas could see the darker ring around Parker's irises, close enough to taste rain in the air. He braced his palms against the wall on either side of Atlas's shoulders, not touching him, not trapping him, containing himself. His arms made a frame that was less a cage and more a surrender. "I could, but I won't." Atlas's breath sharpened. The cedar in the room deepened, shaded by something bruised. Parker's composure held, but only by threads. "You okay?" Atlas asked, voice even. "No," Parker said, and the honesty made it gentler. I didn't like him. Touching you. The admission scraped his throat raw. He swallowed. I know he's your friend. I know you can choose. Still, I didn't like it. Atlas lifted his hand and placed a palm over Parker's sternum, feeling the drum of a heart like a fist on a door. You don't get to cage me because you're scared, he said, firm. He didn't pull away from the closeness. He didn't punish it. He only named the line and set it down like a boundary stone. Parker's jaw worked. There was a brittle sound in his voice when it emerged. Everyone left, he said, each word a separate, careful piece of glass. Don't make me watch you leave too. It wasn't a threat, not a command, a plea that didn't ask Atlas to be smaller, just truer. Parker stepped back on his own, hands lifted off the wall, palms turned outward, empty. The cedar loosening with the space he gave, with the choice. Okay, Atlas said softly, the word a balm. He reached out and caught one of Parker's forearms, pressure light. Thank you. Rain stitched the silence for a moment. Parker's chest rose, fell. The tight thing in the room unwound, the place it left filled with breath. Tea? Atlas asked again. Parker's mouth tilted, almost a smile. Tea. The kettle sang, and Parker reached to silence it, already moving like he belonged in the small kitchen. Atlas watched him pour, watched the careful way he handed over the mug, handle rotated perfectly for Atlas's left hand. Small, ordinary tenderness, the kind that declared itself without fanfare. When Atlas set the mug on the counter, he turned and took both of Parker's hands. They were warm and rough, work-calloused, even though Parker hadn't had a trade in a long time. Perhaps life itself had been the work. Atlas lifted those hands, placed them at his waist, not pushing, not dragging, guiding. Then don't watch, he said, steady eyes on Parker's. Be here. Something luminous and terrified crossed Parker's face, like a man looking at horizon he never thought he'd reach. Is this? He cut himself off, breath-catching. Is this okay? Yes, Atlas said. Parker bowed his head a fraction, reverent. Is this okay? He asked again, rougher, as he took one step closer, palms warming through cotton, thumbs still. Atlas felt his own yes rise like heat from the center of him. Yes, he said, the second time a little breathless. When Parker finally bent and brushed his mouth over Atlas's, it felt like a prayer spoken for the first time. No crushing, no claiming, just a slow, searching kiss that tasted like rain and relief. Heat thrummed under control, a line held not by fear but by care. Atlas opened for him the way he would open a window on a summer night, inviting in air he'd already decided to breathe. Parker pulled back barely an inch, gray eyes hungry and unsure. Still okay? Atlas smiled into his mouth. Yes, he said again, and this third yes settled deep like a key turning. They kissed again, and again after that, neither of them in a hurry to become anything other than exactly what this was. Two mouths learning the map of each other. Two breaths finding a shared rhythm. Parker's hands tightened fractionally at Atlas's waist, and Atlas rose onto his toes, sliding his fingers into Parker's damp hair where his hoodie had missed drying it. The small, involuntary sound Parker made at the touch went straight through Atlas's ribs like sunlight through old glass. The lamp threw a warm, amber pool onto the wall. Rain softened into a hush, house breath sinking to theirs. They moved to the bedroom not because the script demanded it, but because the floor was a bad place for knees, and the bed had become a space where Parker slept, and by sleeping, admitted he could live. Atlas tugged him along with a gentle hand inside Parker's sleeve, and Parker followed as if he had been waiting to be led somewhere that wasn't an edge. At the threshold, Parker stalled. He looked at the bed, the rumpled sheets, the dent where his own head sometimes rested in the chair's shadow, and back to Atlas. Tell me what you want, he said, a low urgency in the words that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with reverence. Tell me if I go wrong. Atlas cupped his jaw, thumb stroking the faint, pale scar that cut along it. You won't go wrong, he said, if you listen. I will, Parker promised, the vow not grand but granular, every minute, every breath. They undressed with an awkwardness that made them laugh, breathless once when Atlas's elbow caught in the hem of his shirt and Parker's hands hovered, not touching until Atlas said, "Help." Then those hands were there, careful on his wrists, lifting cotton free like rescuing a bird. Parker's gaze roved and then stilled, as if checking each part of Atlas for consent. His mouth, his worship, started with the safe places. The line of Atlas's shoulder, the inside of his wrist, the hinge of his jaw. He learned quickly. When Atlas's breath hitched, Parker sealed his attention there, as if mapping the topography of yeses and more theirs with scientific rigor. The slow, reverent pace felt less like wanting and more like building, brick by brick, a shelter no storm could breach. Each time Parker's mouth found a new patch of skin, his eyes flicked up, asking. Atlas answered with his body, with his voice when Parker needed it. Yes. That. Gentle. Good. The words threaded through laughter when Parker's stubble scratched and surprised, through a sharp inhale that had Parker freezing in alarm until Atlas pulled him back with a grin and a, "No, that was," he swallowed. "Good, I liked it." Parker softened into a smile then, a rare and devastating thing. Atlas's answering laugh broke and melted into something else when Parker brought his mouth back to where it had been. Consent lived in the space between every touch. When Parker's hands skimmed lower, he paused. "Okay?" Atlas's throat worked, but his nod was sure. "Okay." The lamp turned off with a quiet click. The rain hushed as if the weather itself were leaning in. What came next blurred at the edges in the way tender things do when you want to remember the feeling more than the details. The cadence of kisses lengthening and slowing, the press of Parker's forehead to Atlas's when they both needed to breathe, the way Atlas's hands guided and then relaxed, trusting, the laughter that came out of both of them unexpectedly when Parker's earnestness tipped into bashful and Atlas teased him into ease. It wasn't about winning, or taking, or even need, though need pulsed through them like a second heartbeat. It was about Parker learning the curve of intimacy not as a cliff to fall from, but a path to walk. Steady, attentive, invited every step. The room filled with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Somewhere, the kettle cooled in the kitchen, forgotten. Somewhere, a car hissed through wet street and faded. In the bed, two bodies settled into a rhythm as old as language and as new as the first word they'd chosen together. Yes. The narrative of the night dimmed, as their breaths deepened into one woven sound and the rain's hush threaded the dark. Parker slept. Not the 9-minute crash of his first night, not the brittle half-rest of a man waiting for alarms, but a slow fall into a place cushioned by scent and the weight of another's arm across his back. He slept with his face in the warm nook of Atlas's neck, his breath dampening the skin there. His arm lay heavy across Atlas's waist, not pinning but promising. "Mine," he murmured into the skin, not the old jagged claim, but a word softened by wonder. Mine, like a name whispered into a clasped hand, as if he couldn't believe it, and to say it aloud might anchor it so he wouldn't float away. Atlas's fingers combed lazily through the short hair at Parker's nape. His own voice came back thick with sleep, and something dizzily content. "Yours," he said, then added, because truth demanded symmetry, "and you're mine." The pillow held both their scents now, cedar and rain braided with orange blossom and tea, warm, blended, the air of a place lived in rather than visited. On the other side of the door, shoes lined up, a fern leaned toward the window. The key bowl on the small table glimmered with metal crescent moons. The whole apartment exhaled, as if it too had been waiting for confirmation that the roof it offered had become a home. Sometime later, when the storm had wandered off to bother another neighborhood, and the street outside had resumed its ordinary traffic of late-night wanderers and delivery vans, a soft sound slid under the threshold. Paper against wood, a rectangle pushed by a careful hand that didn't knock. Morning would find Atlas's foot bumping it, would see Parker stooping to pick it up, the handwriting spare and sharp, pack business, call me, signed with a single letter that carried too much history, M. But for now, the message lay quiet in the dark, like a seed that hadn't decided whether it meant to grow thorns or flowers. Inside the bedroom, Parker's breath sank to Atlas's, and the night held. Chapter 5. Pack Shadows, Chosen Love. The evening air carried the sharp scent of rain still drying from the sidewalks. Atlas and Parker walked side by side, grocery bags bumping lightly against Atlas's leg with each step. Parker had insisted on carrying most of the weight, but Atlas held one bag stubbornly, claiming pride as his excuse. They were almost to the apartment building when a figure peeled from the shadows near the stairwell. Broad-shouldered, familiar in a way that made Parker's body coil instantly tight. Marcel. The man's smirk was sharp as a blade. Well, so this is where the cold alpha ended up. kept by an omega. The words landed with venom, and Parker stiffened, jaw-clenching, but before he could respond, Atlas stepped forward. He set the grocery bag down on the wet pavement with a deliberate thud, eyes steady and clear. "He's not cold," Atlas said, voice low but carrying. "He's mine." For a heartbeat, everything froze. The hum of traffic, the drip of water from the gutters, even the mocking curl of Marcel's lips. Parker's eyes flared wide, not with possessiveness, but with something deeper, rawer. Awe. As though Atlas had handed him back a piece of himself he'd thought lost forever. Marcel's smile thinned. "Cute, but it won't last. He's dangerous. Everyone knows it. Your pack, your neighbors, you think they'll trust him at your side?" Atlas's hand flexed at his side, but his voice never shook. "I don't care what they think." He turned back to Parker, gaze softening. "I care what I choose." Later, inside the apartment, Parker sat on the edge of the couch, shoulders bowed under an invisible weight. Marcel's words clung like oil. His chest ached with the familiar sting of rejection. The same wound reopened again and again until it was a hollow cavern. "You heard him," Parker said, staring at the floor. "The pack's safer without me. Everyone's safer." Atlas crouched in front of him, fingers brushing Parker's knee. But Parker couldn't look up. He reached instead for the key in his pocket, the small bit of metal Atlas had pressed into his hand days ago. It burned against his palm like guilt. "Maybe you deserve better than my ruins," he whispered. His throat was tight as he placed the key carefully on the table, the gesture as final as an apology. "Better than this." He stood, chest caving in on itself, and walked toward the door, each step tearing something deeper. Atlas was faster. He caught Parker at the stairwell, fingers closing around his wrist. The air between them vibrated with panic and stubborn hope. "You don't protect me by cutting me out," Atlas said, voice fierce. His brown eyes burned brighter than any accusation Parker had faced before. "That's not protection. That's abandonment." Parker froze, breath stuttering. Atlas pressed the key back into Parker's palm, wrapping strong, unyielding fingers around his. "Stay. Stay and let me choose you." "I already did." Something inside Parker cracked wide open. His shoulders sagged, a sound escaping him that was half sob, half relief. He gripped the key tight, holding on like it was the only anchor in a storm. "Atlas," his voice broke. "Come home," Atlas whispered, "with me." The apartment door had barely closed before everything unraveled. Parker pressed Atlas against the wood, mouth finding his with a desperate urgency. Their grocery bags lay forgotten by the entryway, apples rolling loose across the floor. Atlas laughed against his lips, the sound trembling with both relief and want. The key slipped from Parker's hand mid-kiss, clattering to the ground and skittering across the tiles. They both startled, then burst into breathless laughter, tears stinging Atlas's eyes, even as Parker's mouth found his again, hungrier. "Don't you dare leave me again," Atlas said between kisses, dragging Parker closer by the hoodie. "Never," Parker swore, voice raw. "I'm here. Always." The kisses turned frantic, the kind that tried to fuse cracks closed. Parker's hands were big and trembling, tracing Atlas's ribs like he was terrified to break him, yet unable to stop touching. Atlas pulled him down, murmuring soft encouragements, teaching him with gasps and whispers where permission lived. When Parker faltered, hesitating, Atlas pressed his lips to the scar along Parker's jaw. "Yes," he said, voice deliberate. "I want this. I want you." Parker's exhale shuddered against Atlas's throat. Atlas tipped his own head, bearing the sensitive line of his collar. Slowly, deliberately, he dragged his scent against Parker's skin, claiming him. His pulse points, his hoodie collar, the hollow where Parker's shoulder met his neck. It wasn't a brand or a cage. It was an offering. A tether. Parker's breath broke audibly, reverence written into every line of his body. He kissed Atlas like gratitude, like devotion, like he was finally allowed to believe. They stumbled toward the bed, laughter caught in tears, hands finding hands. The world narrowed to the warmth of their bodies, the cadence of whispered yeses, and the certainty that whatever they were building, it was theirs. The lamp glowed low. The rain outside blurred the window. They fell into each other. Not with hunger, but with devotion, messy and tender, fading into darkness with fingers laced and breath shared. Later, the kettle hissed gently, filling the silence with ordinary sound. They sat curled together on the couch, Atlas perched sideways on Parker's lap, a honey spoon passed between them. No more closing doors alone, Atlas said firmly, licking honey from his thumb. Parker nodded, eyes intent on the way Atlas smiled at him. No more answering Marcel, Atlas added. No, Parker agreed quickly. Relief threaded his voice. And if the pack wants a meeting? Atlas continued. On our terms, Parker finished, with witnesses. Atlas grinned. Mrs. Dalloway already offered her parlor. She's smug about it. Parker chuckled, low and real, the sound vibrating against Atlas's spine. The phone buzzed once against the table. A simple text glowed on the screen. If you're whole, you're welcome, if you can prove it. Atlas plucked it up before Parker could, deleted it with a sharp tap. You don't prove wholeness to people who broke you, he said, sliding the phone face down. Parker looked at him then, eyes full of something steady, something new. Then to who? Atlas leaned in, pressing his forehead to Parker's. To me, to us, that's enough. And for the first time in years, Parker believed it might be true. Chapter 6. Forever in My Arms. The morning smelled of flowers and wet pavement. Atlas tied another blue ribbon around a graduation bouquet, the stems slick with dew, and stepped back to admire the neatness of the bough. Around him, the flower shop buzzed with families picking up blooms for their graduates. Roses, lilies, daisies, each bundle carrying pride in its petals. Elijah, leaning against the counter with his phone out, narrated the chaos like a sportscaster. And here we see our very own Atlas Monroe, ribbon master, boyfriend to the refrigerator alpha. Elijah, Atlas hissed, ears red. And I am live blogging, Elijah went on, thumbs flying over the screen. Hashtag Atlas Refrigerator Alpha. It's trending in my heart. Atlas shook his head, smiling despite himself. Out of the corner of his eye, Parker stood by the door, holding two finished bouquets with one massive hand each, as if they weighed nothing. His expression was unreadable, but Atlas noticed the way his eyes lingered on him, soft and steady, as though he were memorizing this version of Atlas for keeps. Outside, clouds gathered heavy. Rain began again, slanting across the street, sending umbrellas blooming like flowers. Atlas stepped out with Parker beside him, careful with the bouquets balanced in his arms. A puddle stretched across the sidewalk, deep and glinting. Atlas braced himself to jump. Instead, Parker bent and lifted him without warning, bridal style, one arm under his knees and the other firm around his back. Atlas yelped, clutching the flowers to his chest. Parker! So you don't get wet, Parker said simply, as if it explained everything. A chorus of laughter and wolf whistles erupted from classmates huddled under umbrellas. Elijah shouted, Iconic! From the shop doorway. Atlas buried his face in Parker's shoulder, grinning so hard his cheeks hurt. The ceremony itself blurred, a sea of caps, gowns, and proud voices. When it ended, clusters of students spilled out into the rain-slick courtyard. Families hugged, friends posed for pictures, strangers brushed past with the babble of overlapping conversations. Atlas stood with Parker close by, flowers in his arms, Elijah still making commentary at his side. From the crowd came a voice, muttered sharp enough to cut, Vale's still cold. Some things don't change. Atlas's chest went tight. He glanced at Parker, whose jaw had gone rigid. But instead of reacting, Parker turned to him. His gray eyes searched Atlas's face, asking silently, Should I? Atlas nodded once. Permission. Parker cupped Atlas's cheek, thumb brushing damp skin, and kissed him. Not quick, not tentative. Solid, steady, grateful. A kiss that spoke of belonging, not possession. The crowd stilled. Murmurs shifted, surprise softening into something else. At the edge, Mrs. Dalloway dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, muttering, to no one in particular, About damn time. Atlas smiled into the kiss, warm and sure. When they pulled apart, Parker's shoulders eased for the first time all day. Back home, the small apartment felt different. Not new, but settled, like the space itself had shifted to fit two lives instead of one. Parker set their coats on the hook he had installed by the door. One taller, one shorter. He crouched to screw a second hook into the wall for mugs, steady hands turning the metal until it was firm. Atlas labeled a plant in the window with a scrap of masking tape. Parker's fern, do not overwater. Each small thing slipped into place, ordinary and permanent. The future didn't arrive with trumpets or declarations. It came with a second toothbrush on the sink, two sets of keys in the bowl by the door, the quiet certainty of routines that would repeat. That night, candles flickered on the nightstand, their glow painting the walls in amber. Rain whispered against the window, softer than before. Parker stood at the edge of the bed, hesitant but sure, watching Atlas watch him. For the first time, he stepped forward not as someone being guided, but as someone choosing to lead. "Tonight," he said quietly, "I want to hold you." His voice carried reverence, not command. Atlas's throat tightened. He nodded, climbing back against the pillows. "Then hold me." What followed was slow, tender, unhurried. Parker's hands traced lines across Atlas's skin like cartography, learning every landscape with care. He asked softly each time he touched somewhere new, eyes flicking up, waiting. Atlas answered with a smile, a nod, sometimes with words. "Yes. More. Good." Atlas laughed once when Parker's earnestness turned almost bashful, tugging him down into a kiss that dissolved the tension. The laugh broke into breathless sounds, softer than the storm outside. They whispered small vows, not grand promises of eternity, but something truer. "Every day I will choose you." The words soaked into skin, echoed in the press of lips against pulse points, the brush of fingers tangled tight. The lamp dimmed, and the rain hushed. The world shrank to warmth, to quiet laughter shared against candlelight, to the rhythm of unhurried breaths blending together. The scene faded not in urgency, but in peace. Thunder rolled faintly hours later, but Parker didn't flinch. He slept with his head on Atlas's chest, breath slow, lashes resting against skin. For once, no tension twisted his body. His arm draped across Atlas's waist, weight heavy with trust, not fear. Atlas stroked his hair, gaze tender. "You belong right here," he whispered into the quiet. The storm outside passed, rain easing into silence. The window reflected their figures tangled together, two lives braided into one. On the table by the door, the bowl held two keys, gleaming side by side, sticking, staying, the choice already made.